Hello and good evening. Thank you for joining for tonight's dark and scary cryptid horror stories. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from and if there is a cryptid you would like me to make a story on. Now for tonight's stories, I hope you enjoy. The Beast That Carries Off Dogs. A horror novel. Chapter 1: The Specimen. The carcass stank of winter and wrongness. Dr. Claire Mercer stepped out of her SUV and into the Montana morning, her breath pluming in the February air, her boots crunching on snow that had been pristine until the sheriff's truck had churned it into brown slush. She was 40 miles outside of Ennis, in the Madison Valley, where the ranches stretched toward mountains that looked like teeth and the wind cut through down jackets like they were made of paper. She'd been called because she was the expert. Wildlife biologist, large carnivore specialist, author of papers on wolf reintroduction and bear behavior that were cited by people who would never actually read them. She was here because the local sheriff didn't know what had killed the animal, and because the creature on the ground in front of her was wrong in ways that made her professional detachment difficult to maintain. "Large dog," Sheriff Dalton said, standing upwind with his hands in his pockets. "Rancher's German Shepherd, name was Max, found this morning what was left of him." Claire approached the body. It was large, 90 pounds at least, and it had been torn apart with a ferocity that suggested rage as much as hunger. The chest cavity was open, ribs splayed like fingers, organs gone. The throat was crushed, not bitten, compressed, as if by pressure rather than teeth. "This isn't a wolf kill," Claire said, kneeling beside the carcass. "Figured you'd say that. Wolves don't usually leave the meat." "Wolves don't do this." She pointed at the rib cage. "See the pattern? The ribs were pulled apart, not bitten through. Whatever did this new anatomy understood leverage." She stood, moved around the body, examining the snow. The tracks were the most disturbing part. She'd spent 15 years reading sign, could identify species from a single print in the right conditions. But these... "Asymmetrical," she said. "Look at the gait, something wrong with the locomotion." Dalton peered at the tracks. "Looks like a dog, big one." "It's not a dog. The claw placement is wrong. The pressure distribution." She pulled out her camera, took shots from multiple angles. "This animal was moving on 2 legs part of the time, bipedal." "Bears are bipedal." "Bears plantigrade walk. Flat feet, claws forward. These prints show digitigrade locomotion, walking on the toes, like a dog or a cat or what?" She didn't answer. She was following the tracks, which led away from the carcass in a loping pattern that was wrong, asymmetric, suggesting an injury or a deformity or something that simply wasn't built to move the way it was moving. The tracks led to the tree line. Then they stopped. Not gradually, abruptly, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished or taken off. "These tracks are impossible," she said. Welcome to Montana. Chapter 2: The Warning. They found the ranch hand that afternoon. His name was Eddie Carver, 23, from Wyoming, working the winter season for room and board plus a salary that barely covered his bar tabs. He'd been missing since the previous evening, when he'd gone to check on the sheep in the south pasture. They found him in a snowdrift, half buried, his body positioned with a deliberateness that suggested ritual rather than accident. His chest was open like the dog's, but there was something else. His mouth was frozen open in an expression of, not fear, Claire realized, wonder. His face showed wonder. And his ribs. She had to look away. Professional detachment had its limits. "What the hell happened to him?" Dalton asked, his voice hushed. "Something opened him up," Claire said. "Something that knew exactly where to cut, how to spread the ribs, how to display him." "Display?" "Look at the positioning. The snow has been brushed away. He's been arranged. This is deliberate, Sheriff. This isn't predation. This is communication." "Communicating what?" Claire knelt beside the body, forcing herself to examine the wounds. The chest cavity was empty but not eaten, emptied, cleaned, the organs removed with surgical precision, and the tracks around the body. Same as the dog, she said. Same gait, same asymmetry. Same killer. Same species. Which is? I don't know. Claire stood, looking at the mountains, at the trees, at the vast emptiness that seemed to watch them with ancient patience. But I intend to find out. Chapter 3: The Legend. The Madison Valley History Association was in a converted Victorian house on the main street of Ennis, staffed by volunteers who were old enough to remember when the valley was truly wild. Claire found what she was looking for in the basement archives, under the supervision of a curator named Henry Blackwood, who moved with the careful precision of someone who had broken too many bones to trust his body. "The Ringdocus," Blackwood said, pulling a file from a cabinet that smelled of cedar and decay. "Shot in 1886 by a rancher named Israel Ammon Hutchins, mounted by a taxidermist named Joseph Sherwood, exhibited in his Idaho museum for decades." He laid photographs on the table, black and white, faded but clear enough to show the creature in its glass case. It looked like a canid, dog-like, wolf-like, but the proportions were wrong. The shoulders were too high, hunched like a hyena's. The head was too large, the snout too short. The fur was a reddish color that seemed to glow even in the monochrome photograph. "What is it?" Claire asked. "Unknown." Blackwood's eyes gleamed with the enthusiasm of someone who loved a mystery. Hutchins claimed it wasn't like anything he'd seen before, said it moved wrong, hunted wrong, made sounds that weren't canine. Sounds. Chattering like a monkey or a person with broken teeth. Blackwood pulled another document, a journal entry in spidery handwriting. Hutchins wrote, "It wasn't alone. When I shot the first one, I heard others in the darkness, chattering, waiting. I didn't sleep for 3 days. Others." Plural, whatever the Ringdocus was, it wasn't unique. Claire examined the photograph. The creature's eyes were glass, dead, but they seemed to follow her as she moved. She looked away, looked back, and the effect persisted. "Is the mount still in existence?" Blackwood's expression changed. "Officially, no. It disappeared from Sherwood's museum in the 1970s. Unofficially," he hesitated, "there are rumors, private collectors, underground markets." "And unofficially." Blackwood leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Some say it was never dead, that the taxidermy was a cover, that the creature, healed, woke up, walked away." "That's not possible." "Many things are possible in the Madison Valley, Dr. Mercer." Blackwood straightened, moved to another cabinet. "There's another story you should hear, from the Iowa people, the Shunka Warrakin. The beast that carries off dogs. You know the name." "I know the legend. Every wildlife biologist in the Plain States knows it. A creature that doesn't just kill dogs but takes them, carries them off to somewhere. Not just dogs." Blackwood pulled a leather-bound book from the cabinet. "My grandfather was Iowa. He told me stories about the Shunka Warrakin, about packs of them hunting the old trails, taking prey that was forgotten by their people. Not just dogs. Children, elders, anyone who was alone." "Why?" "Food, of course, but also teaching." Blackwood opened the book, showing illustrations that were crude but effective. "The Shunka Warrakin weren't just predators, they were educators. They showed the tribes what happened when you strayed too far from the group, when you became lonely." "That's not biology, that's folklore." "Is there a difference?" Blackwood smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "Your Eddie Carver, was he alone?" "He was checking sheep." "Alone?" "Yes." "And the dog?" "Also alone. The rancher said it was chained outside." "And you, Dr. Mercer, are you alone?" Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. "I'm here on assignment." "That wasn't the question." "I'm not interested in answering it." "Perhaps you should be." Blackwood closed the book. The Shunka Warrican don't hunt those who are protected. They don't take those who are loved. They take the lonely, the forgotten, the ones no one will miss. I'm not lonely. Aren't you? Blackwood's eyes held hers. Divorced, no children, estranged from your family, living in a rental in Bozeman, counting the days until your next assignment gives you an excuse to leave. How do you know that? I looked you up. Blackwood's smile widened. I'm a historian, Dr. Mercer. I research things, and what I found, well, you're perfect prey. Claire stood, gathering her bag, her notes, her composure. I'm leaving. Be careful, Dr. Mercer. The Ringdocus isn't just a legend, and the Shunka Warrican aren't just stories. They're here. They've always been here, waiting for the right conditions, the right prey. The right lonely prey. Yes. Blackwood's eyes reflected the fluorescent light, and for a moment they looked wrong, too dark, too deep. Sleep well tonight, and if you hear scratching, don't investigate. Chapter 4: The Den. She tried to leave. She intended to drive back to Bozeman, file her report, recommend that the sheriff bring in state investigators or the FBI or anyone who wasn't her. She was a wildlife biologist, not a monster hunter. She studied real animals, not legends. But Dalton called her before she reached the highway. We found something, need you to see it. I'm on my way back too. It's related to your tracks, to the killings. You need to see this, Dr. Mercer, before we seal the area. She turned around. They'd found it in the foothills, 5 miles from where Eddie Carver's body had been discovered. A cave, hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural but, on closer examination, had been deliberately placed. The entrance was tall enough for a person to walk through, narrow enough to suggest claustrophobia. Deputy found it this morning, Dalton said as they approached. Followed the tracks from the Carver scene. They led straight here. Tracks in snow don't last 3 days. These ones did. Fresh tracks, Dr. Mercer. Whatever made them is still here. Claire should have turned back. Should have called for backup, for support, for anyone with a bigger gun and more experience. But professional curiosity was a powerful drug, and the mystery of the asymmetrical tracks, of the surgical kills, of the Ringdocus legend had hooked deep. She entered the cave. The smell hit her first, not the smell of animal but the smell of preservation. Chemicals, formaldehyde, taxidermy supplies, and beneath that something older, something biological, something hungry. The passage widened after 20 feet, opening into a chamber that made Claire stop and stare. It was a museum, or a shrine, or a nest. Bones covered the floor, arranged in patterns that suggested meaning without delivering it. Hundreds of bones, canid, ursid, human, some fresh, with meat still clinging to them, some ancient, weathered to the color of parchment, and among them objects: a rusted cavalry helmet from the 1870s, a beaded necklace that might have been Iowa, a modern baseball cap with the logo of a team that had folded in the 1990s. My God, Dalton whispered, what is this place? A collection, Claire said, moving deeper. Display, look at the arrangement, it's not random, it's curated. Curated by what? She didn't answer. She was examining the walls, where more bones had been arranged in patterns, in spirals, in shapes that suggested writing without being legible. And in the center of the chamber, on a raised platform of packed earth, was something that made her professional detachment shatter. A collar, leather decorated with brass studs cracked with age, and on a tarnished plate still legible, property of Barnum and Bailey, 1879. It's impossible, she breathed. What? Barnum and Bailey, the circus. They toured Montana in the 1870s. There were rumors, stories about strange animals they exhibited, things that weren't quite real. Like what? The Ringdocus. Claire turned to Dalton, and her face was pale in the beam of her headlamp. They called it the Ringdocus, said it was a new species, a wolf-dog hybrid from the Rocky Mountains. And And it escaped. 1886, killed 3 handlers before vanishing into the wilderness. Barnum wrote it off as a loss, claimed it was shot by locals, but some say it was never found, that it bred, that there were others. You're saying this thing, this ringdocus, has been here since 1886. I'm saying the ringdocus was never just one animal. Claire swept her light across the chamber, illuminating the full extent of the collection. I'm saying it's a species, a breeding population, and they've been here in this valley for over a century. A sound from the darkness, a click, a chatter. What was that? Dalton's hand went to his gun. I don't. The movement was at the edge of her vision. Something pale, something wrong, something with shoulders that were too high and a gait that was asymmetric. It moved through the bones without disturbing them, as if it knew exactly where to place each foot. Sheriff, Claire whispered, we need to leave now. I see it. Dalton's gun was out, aimed at the darkness. I see. The thing moved. Fast. Too fast. Dalton fired 3 shots that rang like thunder in the enclosed space, and Claire saw the muzzle flash illuminate the creature for one frozen moment. It was the ringdocus, or a ringdocus. The photograph hadn't prepared her for the reality. The hunched shoulders, the too large head, the mouth that was open in something that wasn't a snarl but was worse. A grin, a chatter, a sound like laughter made from breaking teeth. It wasn't hit. Dalton's shots had gone wide, or the creature had dodged, or bullets simply didn't work on things that shouldn't exist. Run, Claire said. They ran. Back through the passage, toward the entrance, toward the daylight that seemed impossibly far away. Behind them, the chattering multiplied, not one creature but many, a chorus of clicks and chatters that sounded almost like language, almost like mockery. They burst into the open. The snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility, turning the world into a white void. They ran to the sheriff's truck, piled in, locked the doors. What the hell was that? Dalton's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The ringdocus, Claire said. The Shunka warrakin, the beast that carries off dogs. I shot it 3 times. I don't think guns work on them. Then what does? Claire thought of Blackwood's words. They take the lonely, she said, the forgotten, the ones no one will miss. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. She looked back at the cave entrance, now just a darker shape in the falling snow. They're not just animals, Sheriff. They're something else, something that understands us, something that chooses. Chooses what? Who to take? Chapter 5, The Sheriff's Dog. Dalton didn't believe her, not really, not in the way that mattered. He believed something had happened in that cave. He believed his shots had missed, or the creature had dodged, or he'd panicked and imagined the whole thing. He believed Eddie Carver was dead, and Max the German Shepherd was dead, and something needed to be blamed. But he didn't believe in the ringdocus, not as a species, not as a legend, not as a monster that had been hunting the Madison Valley for over a century. His dog convinced him. The dog was named Duke, a Belgian Malinois that had been with Dalton for 6 years. Smart, trained, loyal to the point of obsession. Duke slept in Dalton's house, rode in his truck, accompanied him on every call that wasn't actively dangerous. 3 days after the cave, Duke vanished. I let him out at 10, Dalton said, his voice hollow. Just to do his business. He always comes back, always. Where was he? Backyard fenced. I checked the gate, it was closed. No sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle, he was just gone. Claire drove to Dalton's house. She examined the yard, the fence, the gate. No tracks, no blood. No indication of how a 70-pound dog had been removed from a fenced yard without a sound. The ringdocus, she said. Don't. Sheriff, I know you don't want to hear this, but they're here, they're hunting, and they're taking what they want. A trained police dog, in a fenced yard. They're not just animals, you saw that in the cave. They're intelligent, they plan, they choose. Claire looked at the empty yard, at the fence that suddenly seemed inadequate. And they're patient. They waited until you were alone, until Duke was alone. I'm not alone, I have neighbors, family. Do you? Claire turned to face him. Your wife left last year, your kids are in Billings, your neighbors are half a mile away. By their standards, you're alone. By whose standards? Theirs. Claire gestured at the darkness beyond the fence, at the mountains, at the wilderness that suddenly seemed less empty than it had yesterday. The Shunka Warrican don't hunt in packs. Not really. They coordinate, but they choose individually. They take the ones who won't be missed. The lonely. The forgotten. You said that before, in Blackwood's basement. It's what the legends say. What Blackwood's grandfather said, the Iowa stories. Stories. Stories based on something real. Claire moved to the gate, touched the latch. They're teaching us, Sheriff, showing us what happens when we stray too far from the group, when we become vulnerable. Teaching us to what? Stay together, never be alone. Maybe, Claire looked at the mountains, or maybe they're just hungry and we've made ourselves easy prey. Chapter 6, The Recording. They spent the next week preparing. Claire called in favors from colleagues, from university contacts, from the state wildlife agency. She assembled equipment, trail cameras, audio recorders, motion sensors. She mapped the cave's location, the pattern of disappearances, the historical sightings that stretched back to the 1880s. She learned that the Ringdocus wasn't just a Montana legend. Similar creatures had been reported across the Great Plains. The Shunka Warrican in Iowa, the Wahila in Alaska, the bear dogs of the Dakotas. All featuring the same hunched shoulders, the same chattering vocalizations, the same preference for dogs and the lonely. All connected by the old native trade routes. They're mobile, she told Dalton, spreading maps across his desk. They follow the routes, the same paths that humans have used for centuries. They don't just stay in one place, they migrate. Following what? Prey. Claire traced the routes, the sightings, the disappearances. They move where the food moves, where people are isolated, vulnerable, where the population is sparse and the wilderness is close. And they come back here. They've been coming back here for over a century. This valley, the Madison Valley, it's a convergence point. The routes meet here, the prey gathers here, and they've learned that humans are predictable. Claire looked up from the map. We repeat the same patterns. We put ourselves in the same vulnerable positions. We never learn. She set up her equipment in the foothills near the cave. Cameras on game trails, audio recorders in likely hunting grounds, motion sensors around the perimeter. She spent nights in her SUV, listening to the darkness, waiting for the chattering that would tell her they were close. It came on the 5th night. She was dozing, wrapped in a sleeping bag in the back of her vehicle when the audio recorder triggered. She came awake instantly, reaching for the playback, her heart hammering. The recording was clear, the directional microphone picking up sounds from half a mile away. And what it picked up? Chattering, the same sound she'd heard in the cave but more complex, rhythmic, almost like language. She played it again, and again, trying to identify pattern, structure, meaning. Then she heard the other sound, the one beneath the chattering, the one that made her blood freeze. Whimpering canine, Duke. The dog was still alive. Chapter 7, The Bait. We can't just go in there, Dalton said. It's suicide. Duke is still alive. We don't know that. That could have been a recording, something they learned to imitate. You think they can imitate sounds? I think we don't know what they can do. Dalton's voice was strained. I think we know they hunt intelligently, that they take dogs and people, that they have some kind of social structure. I think going into that cave is exactly what they want us to do. Then what do you suggest? We wait, we watch, we learn their patterns. while Duke dies, while more people disappear. I don't, Dalton stopped. His hand went to his chest, to the place where his badge rested. He's my dog, my partner, I can't just. I know, Claire softened her voice, but we need to be smart, we need to use what we know. What do we know? Claire thought. They're attracted to sound. The chattering, it's communication, but it's also echolocation maybe, or a hunting call. They use it to find each other, to coordinate. So we use sound against them. High-frequency noise, ultrasonic. It disrupts their communication, their coordination. It confuses them. Where do we get something like that? I have an idea. She drove to the Ennie's library, to the local history section, to the files that Blackwood had shown her. The Ringdocus mount, the taxidermy, the preserved remains that had supposedly walked away in the 1970s. But if the creature had walked away, someone must have preserved its vocal cords first. Someone must have recorded its sounds. She found it in Blackwood's notes. Vocalization samples, recorded 1968, Joseph Sherwood. The recordings were stored in the state archives in Helena. She drove through the night, retrieved them, brought them back. They were reel-to-reel tapes, fragile, ancient, but they played, and what they played. The chattering, the same sound from the cave, from the audio recorder, from the darkness, but clearer, more complex, with structure that suggested intelligence. And beneath the chattering, something else. A frequency range that was painful to hear, ultrasonic, infrasonic, something that made Claire's teeth ache and her vision blur. This is it, she said. This is how they hunt, how they communicate, how they choose. Choose. The frequency, it's directional, focused, like sonar. They can pinpoint prey by the way the sound reflects, by the loneliness. That doesn't make sense. It makes sense if you understand what they're detecting. Claire adjusted the playback, filtering the frequencies. They're not just using echolocation, they're reading something else. Emotional state, isolation, the hollow places in a person's life. You're saying they can read emotions. I'm saying they can read something that correlates with emotions, stress hormones, pheromones, the physical signatures of loneliness. Claire looked at the waveforms on her screen. They're not just hunting bodies, Sheriff, they're hunting states of mind. And the high frequency. It disrupts the reading, creates interference, makes them blind. So we use their own sounds against them. Yes. Chapter 8, The Night. They went back to the cave on the 7th night. Dalton was armed, not just his service weapon but a shotgun loaded with slugs. Claire carried the audio equipment, speakers, amplifiers, a looping track of the Ringdocus vocalizations played at high speed, at high frequency. They approached at dusk, moving carefully, quietly. The cave entrance was dark, unguarded, almost inviting. They're waiting, Claire whispered. How do you know? Because they're always waiting. They entered. The passage was unchanged, but the smell was stronger, the chemical preservation, the biological musk, the hunger. Claire could feel her heart rate increasing, her breathing becoming shallow. She was scared. She was also lonely. She could feel the hollowness in her own chest, the emptiness that the creatures could probably sense from miles away. She was perfect bait. Keep the recording ready, she whispered. They moved through the bone chamber. The collection had grown, new additions since their last visit, including a collar that made Dalton stop and stare. Duke, he breathed. He's here somewhere. They moved deeper, following the sound of dripping water, the scent of musk, the feeling of being watched. The main chamber was larger than Claire remembered. Cathedral-sized, the ceiling lost in darkness, the walls covered in the same bone patterns, the same spirals. And in the center, on a raised platform, was something that made her stop and stare. The Ringdocus mount. Not a photograph, the actual specimen, or something that looked exactly like it, preserved, stuffed, displayed, but with glass eyes that reflected the light that seemed to follow her movement. "It's impossible," she whispered. "This was lost in the 1970s. "It's not lost anymore." The voice came from the shadows. Blackwood stepped into the light, moving with a grace that belied his age. He was smiling. "Mr. Blackwood, what are you doing here?" "Waiting, as I have been waiting for many years." He moved to the mount, touched its fur with something like affection. "My grandfather told me the stories, about the Shunka Warakin, about the family that waited in the mountains. He told me that someday I would be called, that I would serve." "Serve?" "They need someone on the outside, someone to identify the lonely, the forgotten, the ones who won't be missed." Blackwood's smile widened. "I gave them Eddie Carver, I gave them your Dr. Mercer. I would have given them the sheriff, but his dog was sufficient." "Duke, where's Duke?" "Duke is family now." Blackwood gestured, and from the shadows emerged a figure that made Dalton cry out. It was Duke, or Duke's body, but the eyes were wrong, reflective, wet glass, the same eyes as the creatures, and the jaw. The jaw had been modified, extended, filled with too many teeth. "They improve their family," Blackwood said. "They incorporate, they adapt. The dogs, the people, they become something more, something better." "You're insane." "I'm enlightened." Blackwood moved closer, and Claire saw that his own eyes were changing, the pupils dilating to fill the iris. "I was lonely too, Dr. Mercer, empty, forgotten. Then I found them, then I understood." The chattering began. From the darkness, from the walls, from everywhere. The creatures were emerging, dozens of them, more than Claire had imagined, their hunched shoulders making them seem smaller than they were, their mouths open in those terrible grins. "Play the recording," Dalton hissed. Claire fumbled with the equipment, her hands shaking. The speakers activated, the high-frequency track blaring into the chamber. The effect was immediate. The creatures screamed, a sound like breaking glass, like tearing metal, like the death of something that had never been alive. They recoiled, paws over their ears, bodies convulsing. Now Claire screamed. They ran, past Blackwood, who was screaming his own scream, not of pain but of betrayal. Past Duke, who was twitching on the platform, caught between dog and something else. Past the mount, the specimen, the preserved thing with glass eyes that followed them. They burst into the night. The snow was falling again, covering their tracks, swallowing their breath. They ran to the truck, drove away, didn't stop until they reached Innie's. Behind them the chattering continued, but it was different now, angry, hunting. They had made themselves targets. Chapter 9: The Sea. They fortified the ranch. Dalton's property was 10 miles from town, surrounded by open land that should have provided warning, visibility, time to react. They set up floodlights, motion sensors, tripwires connected to alarms. They brought in every able-bodied person who would come, ranch hands, hunting guides, even a survivalist from the next valley who claimed to have seen dogmen before. 12 people, armed with rifles, shotguns, high-frequency speakers borrowed from a local concert venue. They established a perimeter, set shifts, waited for dawn. The creatures came at midnight. They didn't charge the house. That would have been too simple, too direct. Instead, they circled, staying at the edge of the floodlights, their chattering creating a harmonic drone that made it impossible to concentrate, to communicate, to think. "They're testing us," Claire said, pressing her hands over her ears, probing for weakness. "We need to use the speakers." "We can't, not yet. The batteries won't last. We need to wait until they're committed." The chattering intensified. From the darkness, they could see movement, pale shapes, hunched shoulders, the reflective eyes that caught the floodlights and threw them back in doubled images. "How many?" Dalton asked. "Too many." Claire counted anyway, 20, 30, more than she had seen in the cave, more than she had imagined existed. "They're not just the local population. They've gathered, called by Blackwood maybe, or by the sound we played." We angered them. We disrupted them. There's a difference. The first attack came from the west. A rush of bodies, claws, teeth. The defenders fired, shotguns booming, and the creatures retreated, but not far, just beyond the light, waiting patient. They're learning, Claire realized, testing our response time, our accuracy, our stamina. We can't hold them all night. We don't have to, Claire checked her watch. Dawn is in 4 hours, they're nocturnal. Light will drive them back. 4 hours is a long time. I know. The second attack came from the east, then the north. Each time the creatures tested a different point, probed for weakness, retreated before casualties could mount. They were intelligent, they were coordinated, they were winning. By 3 a.m. they had breached the perimeter. A ranch hand named Martinez was taken from the barn, his screams cut off mid-cry. The creatures didn't kill him immediately. Claire heard the chattering that followed, the sounds of modification, improvement, incorporation. They're making more, she said, her voice hollow, building their family. We need to end this. Dalton checked his ammunition, down to 3 shells. Claire, the speakers, we have to use them now. Not yet. When? She didn't answer. She was watching the darkness, the patterns of movement, the way the creatures were positioned. They were surrounding the house, yes, but they were also waiting for something. They're waiting for us to make a mistake, she said, to separate, to run. Then we don't run. No, Claire turned to him. We don't run, we bait them. Bait them how? I go out there, alone. That's suicide. It's what they want, what they expect, the lonely one walking into the darkness. She picked up the speaker equipment, the high-frequency generator. I walk to the center of the field, turn on the speakers, maximum output, catch them in the blast radius. They'll kill you before you get there. Not if I'm fast, not if I'm unexpected. She looked at the remaining defenders. You cover me. When they swarm, when they're committed, you fire. Not at them, at the ground. Make noise, confuse them. This is insane. It's the only way. She met his eyes. Duke is out there. Martinez is out there. The others, they're being turned into something else. We have to stop it. We have to end the family. How does this end it? It disrupts them, scatters them, makes them alone. She saw the word hit him. Alone. The thing they feared most. The thing they had tried to eliminate by becoming collective. Go, he said, but I'm covering you. Chapter 10, The Bait. She walked into the snow. It was falling harder now, reducing visibility to 20 feet, turning the world into a white void where shapes moved at the edge of perception. She carried the speaker in one hand, the frequency generator in the other, her finger on the trigger. The chattering stopped. She was in their territory now, in their space. She could feel their attention, their hunger, their curiosity, the lonely one walking willingly into darkness, the perfect prey. She counted her steps, 20, 30, 50, reaching the center of the field where the floodlights barely reached, where the darkness was thickest. She activated the speaker. The high-frequency sound blasted outward, ultrasonic, painful. The ringdocus vocalizations played at maximum volume, maximum speed. The creatures screamed, a sound like tearing metal, like breaking glass, like the death of community. They swarmed. From every direction they came, pale shapes, hunched shoulders, the teeth and claws that had killed and incorporated so many. Claire saw them clearly for the first time. The hyena bodies, the wolf heads, the shoulders that were broken and wrong. They weren't one species. They were many, combined, improved. She stood her ground. The speaker screamed. The creatures convulsed, paws over their ears, mouths open in silent shrieks. Now she screamed. Dalton fired. Not at the creatures, but at the ground, the air, creating noise, confusion. The other defenders joined, shotguns booming, creating chaos. The creatures didn't retreat. They couldn't. The frequency was scrambling their coordination, their communication, their unity. They were individual now, alone, terrified, reverted to animal panic. Claire saw one of them clearly. It was looking at her with eyes that were suddenly, horribly human, pleading, afraid. Then it ran. Others followed. The swarm broke, fragmented, individual creatures fleeing into the darkness, into the snow, into the isolation they had tried to escape. The family was broken. Chapter 11, The Aftermath. Dawn found them standing in the field, surrounded by bodies. Not all the creatures had fled. Some had stayed, fought, died. They lay in the snow, their hunched shoulders finally still, their mouths open in silent screams. Claire counted 8. Too many to be the entire population, but enough to suggest the family had been damaged. And among them, the modified ones. Duke was dead, so was Martinez. Their bodies were twisted, wrong, caught in the process of incorporation that Claire's frequency had interrupted. They were mercies, she knew, better dead than what they were becoming. But there was no sign of Blackwood, no sign of the Mount, no sign of the Ringduckus specimen. They'll regroup, Dalton said, rebuild. Yes. Claire looked at the mountains, at the wilderness that had always seemed empty and now seemed crowded with watching. They're patient. They've survived for over a century. They'll survive this. Then what do? We learn, we remember, we teach others. She turned to him. The Iowa knew, the old tribes knew. They passed the stories down. We forgot because we thought they were superstition. We need to remember. Remember what? That we're not alone out here, that the wilderness isn't empty, that there are things, old things, patient things that watch us, that choose us, that take the lonely. You're saying we can't defeat them. I'm saying we can only survive them, by being together, by remembering, by never becoming bait. They buried the bodies, the dead creatures, the modified ones. They told the families that it was a wolf attack, a rabid pack, a tragic accident. The truth would have been worse. Claire stayed in Montana for another month, helping with the cleanup, the documentation, the official reports. She wrote a paper on anomalous canid behavior that would be filed and forgotten. She consulted with state wildlife officials, with tribal historians, with anyone who would listen. Then she packed her bags and left. Chapter 12, The Gift. 6 months later, she was living in Oregon, working for a conservation group that tracked wolf populations in the Cascades. The memories had faded, become dreamlike. The fear had subsided, replaced by the ordinary anxieties of ordinary life. She had started dating. A man from the office, kind, attentive, divorced like her. They were taking it slow. She was learning to trust again, to hope. She wasn't lonely anymore, not really. The package arrived on a Tuesday, no return address, no postage. Inside was a collar, leather decorated with brass studs, tarnished with age. And a note in careful handwriting. You were never alone, Dr. Mercer. You were always watched. You were always chosen. We are waiting. She threw the collar away, burned the note, changed her locks, her number, her address. But sometimes late at night she heard it, the scratching, at the door, at the window, at the edge of her dreams. The chattering, the patient, loving, hungry sound of family. Epilogue. The Ringduckus Mount was never found. Blackwood was never found. The Shunka Warakin were never officially acknowledged. But in the Madison Valley, people still disappeared, still vanished from their beds, their yards, their lives. The official reports called them accidents, runaways, animal attacks. The unofficial stories were different. Stories about the beast that carries off dogs. Stories about family. Stories about the lonely. And in the Ennie's library in the local history section, if you knew which files to check, you could find a photograph. Black and white, faded. A mounted creature with hunched shoulders and too many teeth. And glass eyes that followed you. Always. The Hollowing, a horror novel. Chapter 1, The Tape. The cassette recorder sat on the motel dresser like a casket for secrets, its plastic shell yellowed by decades of nicotine and neglect. Dr. Lillian Valentine pressed the rewind button and listened to the mechanical whir, counting the seconds until it clicked, empty, hollow, wrong. She'd found it in the storage locker of a dead man, tucked between medical textbooks and half-empty bottles of Valium. The label in her father's handwriting read simply, "Do not play." She played it anyway. Static first, then breathing wet labored, the sound of lungs drowning in something thicker than air. A man's voice trembling. "This is Dr. Harold Vance, forensic anthropologist, Allegan County Medical Examiner's Office." Date: October 14, 1987. Subject: unidentified remains recovered from the vicinity of Felt Mansion, Laketon Township, Michigan. Lillian leaned closer. The motel room seemed to contract around her, the peeling wallpaper pressing inward like diseased skin. Outside, somewhere beyond the thin walls, something scraped against the aluminum siding. She ignored it. Preliminary examination reveals extensive cranial trauma consistent with blunt force. However, a pause, paper rustling. The skull fractures are not consistent with animal predation. The bite marks, they're human, but the jaw structure is wrong. The teeth are too small, the palate too wide, like a child's mouth stretched over something. Hungrier. The scraping outside intensified, rhythmic, deliberate. "I've reconstructed the mandible. The wear patterns suggest a diet of bone, not marrow extraction, actual consumption. The enamel degradation corresponds to static," swallowed the next words, and when the voice returned it was hushed, nearly inaudible. "They're not human, not anymore. They remember enough to mimic. The last victim was found holding a telephone. The coroner thought she'd been calling for help, but the phone wasn't plugged in. She wasn't calling out, she was answering." The tape clicked off. Lillian sat in the dark, counting her breaths. 17 years as a psychiatrist specializing in neurological disorders, 5 of those years spent treating patients with hydrocephalus, and she'd never heard her father speak like that. The Harold Vance she'd known was clinical, precise, a man who measured grief in millimeters and trauma in grams. This voice on the tape, it belonged to someone who had seen the membrane between reality and nightmare tear open. Something scratched against the wall again, closer now, just below the window. Lillian rose slowly, her hand finding the baseball bat she'd propped beside the door. The motel was called the Bluebird, an optimistic name for a place where the carpet smelled like mildew, and the previous occupant had left stains she didn't want to identify. She'd rented it because it was cheap, and because it was close to the Felt Mansion, the historic site where her father had recorded his final professional testament before vanishing into the Michigan woods. Before becoming another statistic in the Allegan County Missing Persons database. The window was a rectangle of black glass. Beyond it, the parking lot stretched empty except for her Subaru, which sat alone beneath a sodium light that buzzed like an electric insect. The trees began 20 feet from the lot's edge, second-growth hardwoods that had reclaimed farmland abandoned during the Depression. Locals called this stretch of County Road Melon Head Alley. Lillian approached the window. Her reflection stared back. 34 years old, dark circles carved beneath eyes that had stopped sleeping properly 3 months ago, black hair pulled into a functional ponytail. The face of a woman who had lost her license to practice medicine, her marriage, and her faith in rational explanation within the span of 18 months. The face of a woman desperate enough to chase ghosts. She reached for the curtain. The scraping came again, nails on aluminum, high and thin. A child's sound, or something approximating one. Her phone buzzed. Lillian jumped, nearly dropping the bat. She fumbled for the device and the screen illuminated with a number she didn't recognize. Local area code. She answered. Dr. Valentine. A man's voice, older, with the careful diction of someone accustomed to public speaking. Speaking. She kept her eyes on the window. The scraping had stopped. This is Arthur Pemberton. I'm the president of the Allegan County Historical Society. I believe you're expecting my call." She was. The Historical Society had contacted her 3 days prior, offering a consulting fee that bordered on obscene for someone with her professional reputation in ruins. They wanted her expertise on neurological disorders. Specifically, they wanted her to examine historical medical records related to the Melon head phenomenon and provide a scientific explanation for what they insisted was mere folklore. "I wasn't expecting you until morning, Mr. Pemberton. Please call me Arthur, and I apologize for the hour, but there's been an incident, another disappearance, a jogger on the bike trail near the bridge. The sheriff's department is calling it a probable animal attack, but," he hesitated, "the circumstances are similar to previous cases, the ones your father investigated." Lillian's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm not interested in rehashing my father's work. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to help us understand what we're dealing with before more people die. The Historical Society has access to documents that weren't available to your father, records from the Felt estate, medical files from the 1950s. Dr. Valentine, I believe these creatures, whatever they truly are, were created deliberately, and I believe you might be the only person who can help us understand the neurological implications." The window was still dark, but her reflection was wrong. Lillian stared at the glass. In the black mirror of the night, her shadow seemed to have grown taller, stretched into something with a distended cranium that pressed against the top of the frame. She blinked, and it was gone. Just her own exhausted face staring back. "Dr. Valentine, are you still there?" "Yes," her voice came out hoarse. "I'll meet you tomorrow, where?" "The Felt Mansion, 9 o'clock, but I must warn you, don't go near Crybaby Bridge tonight. Whatever you do, stay away from the bridge." The line went dead. Lillian lowered the phone slowly. The motel room felt colder now, the air thickening with something she couldn't name. She turned from the window and grabbed her coat, her keys, her father's tape recorder. She was a skeptic by training and by trauma. Too many patients diagnosed with demonic possession by their families. Too many cases of childhood schizophrenia mislabeled as supernatural intrusion. She didn't believe in monsters, but she believed in her father's fear. She'd heard it in his voice, raw and undeniable. And she knew, with the certainty of a daughter who had found her father's empty shoes beside a forest trail, that Crybaby Bridge was exactly where she needed to go. Chapter 2: The Bridge. The bike trail was unlit, a ribbon of crushed limestone that wound through state game land where hunting was prohibited and humanity was merely tolerated. Lillian parked her Subaru at the trailhead, a gravel turnout marked by a wooden sign warning about tick season and Lyme disease, and stepped into the October dark. Her flashlight cut a narrow cone through the blackness. The trees pressed close here, their branches forming a tunnel that seemed to lean inward, curious, hungry. She walked for 10 minutes, counting her steps to keep her mind occupied until she heard it, water running over stone. Crybaby Bridge earned its name from a century of tragedy. A farmer's wagon overturned in the flood of 1912, drowning 3 children. A mother threw her infant from the railing in 1947, then followed herself. A teenager's car stalled on the tracks in 1968, the train invisible in fog until impact. The locals said if you stood on the bridge at midnight and listened, you could hear the crying. Not echoes, something else, something present. Lillian didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in acoustics, in infrasound frequencies that could induce dread, in the psychological power of place. She was a scientist. She would observe. She would record. The bridge materialized from the darkness, a concrete span barely wide enough for a single vehicle, its railings rusted, its surface slick with moss. The creek below was swollen with autumn rain, rushing fast enough to drown out the forest's usual nocturnal symphony. No crickets, no owls, just water and the wind in the branches. She stepped onto the bridge. The concrete was colder than it should have been, even for October. Her breath plumed in the beam of her flashlight, and she realized the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the space of 5 steps. Her scientific mind noted hypothermia risk, calculated exposure times, even as her hindbrain screamed at her to run. Lillian reached the center of the span and stopped. She turned off her flashlight. The dark was absolute, not the darkness of closed eyes, but the darkness of absence, of light itself being consumed. She stood in the void, listening to her heartbeat, counting the seconds. 30, 40, 50. A sound, not crying, breathing. It came from beneath the bridge, wet, rhythmic, the respiration of something large and patient, something that had been waiting. Lillian's hand found the flashlight. She didn't turn it on. Hello. The breathing stopped. Is someone there? I'm a doctor, I can help. Silence, then Lion. Her name, spoken in a whisper that wasn't quite a whisper, more like several voices speaking simultaneously, slightly out of sync, creating a harmonic dissonance that made her teeth ache. The voices were high-pitched, childlike, but processed through vocal cords that had been stretched, warped, modified into something that could approximate human speech without ever achieving it. Lion. She turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the far end of the bridge, where the trail continued into the woods. Nothing. She swept it down toward the creek bank and froze. It was crouched at the edge of the water, silhouetted against the rushing current. Humanoid but wrong. The proportions were inverted. Legs too short, torso compressed, arms that hung nearly to the ground. And the head. The head was enormous. Not enlarged through disease or deformity in any way she recognized. This was structural, architectural, as if someone had taken a child's skull and expanded it in all dimensions, stretching the skin thin as paper over the bulging cranium. The face was visible in profile. Eyes too large, reflecting her flashlight back at her like wet glass. A mouth that seemed to split the lower half of the face, lipless, showing small, perfect teeth in a permanent grin. It turned toward her. The eyes caught the light and held it, twin mirrors that showed her not her own reflection but something else, something standing behind her, its hand already reaching for her shoulder. She spun, flashlight sweeping, finding nothing but empty bridge. When she turned back, the figure was gone. But the breathing continued, closer now, from the trees on the near bank, from the shadows beneath the bridge, from the dark water itself. Lion. She ran. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as she sprinted back toward the trailhead, her boots skidding on the moss-slick concrete. She didn't look back. She knew, with the certainty of prey, that looking back would be fatal. Whatever was in those woods had been seen. It had been acknowledged, and now it was interested. The trail seemed longer in reverse, the trees leaning closer, their branches snatching at her coat. She could hear it following, not running but loping, a gait that was wrong, asymmetric, something that moved on legs designed for a different geometry of gravity. The sound of its passage through underbrush was minimal, almost delicate, as if it knew how to be quiet when it chose. Her car. She could see the reflection of her headlights, the interior light she'd left on, a beacon of modernity in the ancient dark. She reached for her keys, fumbling, dropping them in the gravel. Behind her, the loping stopped. Lillian bent, scrabbling for the keys, and her hand closed on metal. She straightened, pressed the unlock button, and risked a glance backward. The trail was empty. But the tree line, there at the edge of her vision, something stood in the shadow of an oak, watching. Its head was visible above the underbrush, a pale moon in the darkness, and she could feel its attention like pressure against her skull, a physical weight that made her sinuses ache. She got in the car and locked the doors. The engine turned over on the second try. She reversed out of the turnout, gravel spraying, and accelerated onto the county road without looking in the rearview mirror. She drove until she saw the lights of a gas station, until she was surrounded by fluorescent hum and the smell of diesel, and the mundane reality of a world that still obeyed physical laws. Only then did she pull over and vomit onto the shoulder. She sat in the driver's seat afterward, trembling, her phone in her hand. She should call the sheriff. She should report what she'd seen. But what had she seen? A figure in the dark. A delusion brought on by stress and sleep deprivation and the power of suggestion. She was a disgraced psychiatrist with a history of malpractice allegations and a recently expired prescription for antipsychotics. No one would believe her. But Arthur Pemberton might. She found his number in her recent calls and pressed redial. It rang twice before he answered. "Dr. Valentine, I told you not to go to the bridge." "I saw it." Her voice was steady now, clinical, the professional mask sliding back into place. "I observed a humanoid figure with pronounced cranial deformities, consistent with the Melon head descriptions in local folklore. It displayed what appeared to be cognitive function. It spoke my name." "It spoke to you?" "It mimicked speech, multiple voices overlaid." She paused. "And Mr. Pemberton, it was organized. It wasn't attacking, it was observing, studying." The line was silent for so long she thought she'd lost the connection. Then, "Meet me at the mansion in the morning. And Dr. Valentine, whatever you do, don't sleep in your car tonight. Find a hotel, with people, with witnesses." "Why?" "Because they only take the lonely." Chapter 3: The Records. The Felt Mansion rose from the lakeshore like a monument to forgotten wealth, its sandstone walls weathered by a century of Michigan winters, its turrets and gables casting shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun. Lillian arrived at 9, exactly as instructed, to find Arthur Pemberton waiting on the veranda with 2 cups of coffee. He was 70, perhaps older, with the build of a man who had spent his life in libraries and archives rather than fields and forests. His suit was expensive but rumpled, his eyes magnified behind thick glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He looked, Lillian thought, like a man who had been interrupted in the middle of something important and never allowed to return. "Dr. Valentine, I'm glad you survived the night." "I'm not sure survive is the appropriate term." He handed her a coffee. "Come inside, there's something you need to see." The mansion's interior was a museum of Gilded Age excess. Parquet floors, Tiffany windows, a staircase that spiraled upward like a DNA helix. But Pemberton led her past the public rooms, down a servant's corridor, to a basement archive that smelled of mold and old paper. The Felt family donated the estate to the Historical Society in 1958, he explained, unlocking a heavy steel door. But the medical records from the asylum period remained sealed until last year. We found them during renovations. Asylum period. Pemberton switched on a fluorescent light that flickered and hummed. The mansion served as a private neurological hospital from 1948 to 1956. Dr. Silas Crow's Hydrocephalic Research Institute. Officially, it treated children with water on the brain. Unofficially, he pulled a file box from a shelf and set it on a folding table. "Dr. Valentine, I believe your father found these records. I believe he was trying to understand what Crow created, and I believe that's what killed him." Lillian opened the box. Inside were patient files, hundreds of them, handwritten in ink that had faded to brown. She selected one at random and read the label, Subject 47, Age 11, Diagnosis, Severe Hydrocephalus. Treatment commenced March 3, 1952. She opened the file. The first photograph made her drop her coffee. The child in the image had a head that was grotesquely enlarged, swollen to the size of a watermelon. The skin stretched so thin that the vascular network was visible as a purple web. But it was the eyes that arrested her, their intelligence, their awareness, the terrible consciousness looking out from that ruined face. "This isn't hydrocephalus," she said. This is surgical." Someone expanded the cranium deliberately. Dr. Crow. Pemberton pulled another file, then another. He believed that hydrocephalus wasn't a disease to be cured but a condition to be optimized. He thought that by increasing intracranial pressure and expanding the skull, he could create connections, neural pathways that didn't exist in normal humans, shared consciousness, hive intelligence. That's not science, that's torture. It's both. Pemberton spread documents across the table, surgical diagrams, chemical formulas, photographs that showed children strapped to tables while needles disappeared into their fontanelles. Crow was funded by private investors who believed in eugenics, in psychic research, in the next stage of human evolution. He operated on 53 children over 8 years. None of them survived the procedures officially. Pemberton opened a final folder. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 1956, yellowed and brittle. Mental Hospital Fire KILLS founder, 12 patients. The photograph showed the mansion engulfed in flames, firefighters silhouetted against the inferno. The fire was arson, Pemberton said, set by parents who discovered what Crow was doing, but the bodies, they were never properly identified. 12 charred remains, all adult-sized, Dr. Crow and his staff. But what about the children, the 53 subjects? Lillian felt cold spread through her chest, a liquid nitrogen flood. They weren't in the building. They'd been moved. 3 days before the fire, Crow transferred his successes to an underground facility, a network of tunnels beneath the mansion, built during Prohibition for smuggling. The children were down there when the fire started, and they've been down there ever since. That's impossible. They'd be in their 70s now. Pemberton removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief that trembled slightly. Time doesn't pass the same way underground, Dr. Valentine, and whatever Crow did to them, it changed them. The physical changes you observed, the enlarged cranium, the distorted features, those are permanent. But the psychological changes, he replaced his glasses. They share thoughts, Dr. Valentine. They experience each other's sensations. They hunt as one mind distributed across multiple bodies. And they're hungry. Hungry for what? Connection. Pemberton's voice dropped to a whisper. Crow believed he was creating a new form of family, a collective where individual suffering was dissolved into group consciousness. But he made them hungry first. He starved them to heighten their sensory acuity. He fed them. He couldn't finish. Lillian didn't need him to. She looked at the photograph of Subject 47, at those knowing eyes. They eat people. They incorporate people. Pemberton pulled a map from the wall, revealing a schematic of tunnels beneath the mansion. The disappearances your father investigated. He found evidence that the Melon heads weren't just killing their victims. They were preserving them, keeping them alive for days, sometimes weeks, while they experimented. Experimented how? Crow's original research involved injecting spinal fluid from donors into his subjects. He believed it would accelerate the neural integration. The Melon heads have continued the practice, but they need fresh donors, young ones preferably, isolated ones. People know one will miss quickly. Lillian thought of her father, alone in these woods, chasing rumors of monsters. She thought of her own isolation, her revoked license, her failed marriage, the apartment in Detroit where her only regular visitor was a process server. They only take the lonely, she repeated. Yes. And I'm very lonely, Mr. Pemberton. He met her eyes. That's why they spoke to you. That's why they didn't attack. They're recruiting, Dr. Valentine. They want you to join them. The fluorescent light flickered overhead. In its strobe, Lillian saw something move in the tunnel entrance, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, a suggestion of distended cranium and reflective eyes. Mr. Pemberton, she said carefully, when you said the records were sealed until last year, who unsealed them? I did, with the help of. The lights went out. In the absolute dark, she heard it. The wet breathing, the harmonic whisper, the voice that was many voices saying her name like a prayer and a threat. Lion, we've been waiting. And then from directly behind her in Pemberton's voice, "Don't turn around, Dr. Valentine. Please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She turned. The flashlight in her hand illuminated a scene from Nightmare. Pemberton stood with his back against the filing cabinets, his glasses gone, his face a mask of terror. Behind him, pressed close enough to share his breath, was a melon head, its arms too long, jointed wrong, wrapped around the old man's chest in an embrace that was almost tender. Its massive head rested on Pemberton's shoulder, those wet glass eyes fixed on Lillian with something that might have been affection. "He let us in," the creature whispered, and its mouth moved in perfect synchronization with Pemberton's trembling lips. "He wanted to understand. We wanted to be understood. Now we understand each other." "Let him go." Lillian's voice was steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I'm the one you want. I'm the lonely one." The creature's smile widened, showing those small, perfect teeth. "We want you both. Family is never complete. Family always hungers." It moved faster than anything human could move, a blur of pale flesh and grasping limbs. Lillian had time to register the smell, sweet, corrupted, like fruit left too long in the sun. And then she was running, up the stairs, through the servants' corridor, into the mansion's main hall where morning light streamed through Tiffany glass and made everything seem suddenly, terribly normal. She didn't stop until she reached her car. The engine started. She reversed down the driveway, not caring about the landscaping, about the historical preservation regulations, about anything except distance. She drove for 20 minutes before realizing she was sobbing, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the wheel. Pemberton was gone. She knew it with the certainty of someone who had seen the look in those eyes, the look of a man who had invited the wolf in, and discovered too late that it wasn't interested in conversation. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. It buzzed again and again insistently. Finally, she pulled over and looked. A text message from an unknown number. A photograph. Arthur Pemberton, sitting in the basement archive, his head resting on the creature's shoulder. His eyes were open, aware, and his mouth was moving in a smile that didn't belong to him. The caption, "He says hello, Lil. Lion, he says welcome home." And beneath that, a location pin. The Felt Mansion. And 3 words that made her put the car in drive and turn back toward the darkness. "We are waiting." Chapter 4, The Tunnels. She didn't go immediately. That would have been suicide, and despite everything, despite the revocation of her medical license, the dissolution of her marriage, the creeping suspicion that her own sanity was fraying like wet paper, Lillian Valentine did not want to die. She went to the library instead. The Allegan District Library was a modern building of glass and steel, aggressively cheerful in its denial of the darkness that lurked in the county's older corners. Lillian spent 6 hours in the local history section, reading everything she could find about Dr. Sela's crow, the Felt Mansion, and the Melon Head legend. The official story was straightforward. Crow was a quack who had performed unauthorized experiments on disabled children, a monster in a white coat who had deserved his fiery end. The Melon Head stories were dismissed as urban legends, campfire tales for teenagers who wanted to scare each other on deserted roads. But in the gaps between official accounts, in the letters to the editor and the oral histories collected by folklore students, another narrative emerged. Residents who remembered the 1950s spoke of lights in the woods, of children who weren't quite children glimpsed at twilight, of a sound like wind chimes made from bone that preceded bad luck and sudden death. One interview, conducted in 1978 with a former nurse who had worked at Crow's Institute, contained a phrase that chilled Lillian's blood. The children weren't victims, not all of them. Some of them wanted what Dr. Crow offered. They wanted to stop being alone in their heads. The procedure, it worked in a way. They could hear each other thinking. They could feel what the others felt. It was addictive. Some of the subjects tried to perform the surgery on themselves after Crow stopped them. Lillian thought of her patients with hydrocephalus, the ones whose ventricles had swollen with cerebrospinal fluid until their skulls expanded like balloons. She treated them with shunts and medication, trying to normalize their brain pressure, to give them back the individuality that the disease was eroding. She'd never considered that some might not want individuality, that some might crave dissolution into something larger, something collective, something that would never be alone. She thought of her own loneliness, the apartment that was too quiet, the bed that was too empty, the meals eaten in front of screens that showed her other people's lives, other people's connections, other people's families. She understood the hunger. That was what made it terrifying. Her phone buzzed, another text from the unknown number, this time a video. She almost didn't watch it. She knew, with the certainty of prey, that watching would be a form of surrender. But she also knew that running wouldn't work. They had found her at the motel. They had found Pemberton in his archives. Distance was no protection against something that could whisper your name from 100 yards away. She pressed play. The video was shaky, filmed in infrared, showing a tunnel lined with brick. Water dripped from the ceiling and the walls were covered in markings, crayon drawings she realized made by children. Stick figures holding hands, larger figures with distended heads, and everywhere the same word written in what she desperately hoped was marker, father. The camera moved deeper into the tunnel. The drawings grew more sophisticated, more disturbing. Anatomical diagrams showing skulls split open, brains swelling like yeast dough, chemical formulas, and faces, dozens of faces, all with the same wide eyes, the same knowing smile, the same cranial distortion. The camera rounded a corner. The tunnel opened into a chamber, roughly circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, lit by candles that made the shadows dance like living things. And in the center, arranged in a spiral pattern, were the Melon heads. Lillian counted 13. They sat cross-legged, their massive heads gleaming in the candlelight, their two small hands folded in their laps. They were naked, their bodies wasted, ribs visible beneath skin that seemed too large for their frames. But their faces were peaceful, serene. They looked like saints in a medieval painting, if saints had been created by a god who hated the human form. In the center of the spiral sat Arthur Pemberton. He was alive. That was the first thing Lillian registered. The second was that he was smiling, not the terrified rictus of their encounter in the archive, but a genuine expression of contentment. His eyes were closed. His breathing was slow and regular. And his head. She leaned closer to the screen, her professional curiosity momentarily overwhelming her horror. His cranium seemed larger than it had been, the proportions subtly wrong. As she watched, one of the Melon heads, smaller than the others, perhaps the youngest, crawled forward and pressed its forehead against Pemberton's temple. The old man's smile widened. His eyes opened, and they were different. Not human eyes anymore, but reflective, wet glass orbs that caught the candlelight and threw it back in doubled images. "It doesn't hurt," he whispered, and his voice harmonized with the Melon head's whisper, creating that terrible stereo effect. "It feels like falling into warm water, like finally not being alone." The video ended. Lillian sat in the library's fluorescent brightness, surrounded by the mundane sounds of computer keys and turning pages, and felt the boundaries of her world contract to a single point. She had a choice. She could drive back to Detroit, file a missing person report for Arthur Pemberton that would be ignored like her father's, try to rebuild a life that had been crumbling before she ever came to Michigan. Or she could go into the tunnels. She thought of the children in Crow's photographs. She thought of Subject 47's knowing eyes. She thought of her father, somewhere in these woods, his last words on tape describing bite marks that were human but wrong. She thought of the loneliness that had driven her to this place, this moment, this choice. She gathered her things and walked out of the library. In the parking lot, she found a note tucked beneath her windshield wiper, a childish drawing of a family, all holding hands, all with the same oversized heads. And beneath it, in careful block letters, "The door is open." She drove back to the mansion. Chapter 5: The Descent. She found the entrance behind the collapsed carriage house, where Pemberton's map indicated a storm cellar that had been bricked over in the 1960s. The bricks were new, months old, not decades, and they had been removed recently, stacked neatly to one side like someone had been expecting a visitor. The stairs descended into darkness that smelled of earth and water and something else, something sweet and corrupting. Lillian descended carefully, her flashlight in one hand, her phone in the other with 911 pre-dialed. She knew she wouldn't get signal underground, but the pretense of connection comforted her. The stairs ended in a tunnel, brick-lined, roughly 7 feet high, with a floor that sloped gently downward. The air was cold, much colder than the October afternoon above, and she could see her breath pluming in the flashlight beam. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, creating a rhythm that sounded almost like footsteps. She walked for what felt like hours. The tunnel branched again, formed a network that Pemberton's map had only hinted at. She followed the drawings on the walls, crayon arrows pointing deeper, stick figures beckoning her forward. They were fresh. The wax hadn't even begun to collect dust. At the third junction, she found the first sign of recent habitation, a pile of clothing neatly folded, a woman's running gear, sneakers, a water bottle still half full. The jogger who'd disappeared, she realized. The one Pemberton had mentioned. She'd been down here, she'd been prepared. Lillian touched the fabric. It was damp, but not with water. Something else, something that smelled like the sweet rot she'd noticed earlier. She wiped her hand on her pants and kept moving. The tunnel widened. The ceiling rose until she was walking through a cathedral of stone and brick, her footsteps echoing back at her from walls she couldn't see. And then she heard it, the breathing, the harmonic whisper, the sound of family. Lil's lion. She stopped. Her flashlight found them, silhouettes at the edge of visibility, their massive heads blocking the tunnel ahead. Not 13 now. More. Many more. She counted 20, 30 before she gave up, realizing that the shadows themselves were moving, that the darkness had become populated with things that had once been children. "I want to talk," she said, and her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. "I want to understand." Understand. The whisper repeated her word, but it was echoed by dozens of voices, a chorus that made the stone vibrate. Understanding is joining. Joining is understanding. "Not yet. First, tell me about my father." Silence. Then movement. A figure pushing through the crowd, smaller than the others, moving with the hesitation of something that remembered shame. It came into the light, and Lillian saw that it was old, ancient, even, its skin translucent with age, its eyes milky with cataracts. But its head was still grotesquely enlarged, still bearing the marks of Crow's surgery. "Your father," it whispered, and its voice was singular, cracked, human. "He came to help. He wanted to save us." "Save you from what?" "From hunger." The old creature's mouth opened in what might have been a smile. "From the emptiness that never fills. Crow made us able to share, but he didn't give us enough to share. We're always hungry, Dr. Valentine, always empty. Your father wanted to find a way to fill us without taking. And he found it, but finding isn't sharing. He wouldn't join, he tried to leave." Lillian's hand tightened on the flashlight. "Where is he now?" The old creature turned and gestured into the darkness behind it. "He stayed. He understood in the end that leaving would be cruel, that we needed him, that we need you." The crowd parted. The flashlight beam reached into the space they'd occupied, illuminating a chamber that made Lillian's carefully constructed composure shatter like glass. Her father was there. He sat against the far wall, his legs crossed, his hands folded in his lap. He was dressed in the clothes he'd been wearing when he disappeared, khaki pants, a button-down shirt, a jacket that had been fashionable in 1987. His skin was waxy, preserved by the cold and the dry air but otherwise intact. He looked peaceful. But his skull had been opened. Not surgically, surgically would have been precise, controlled. This was something else, something desperate and hungry. The bone had been pried apart, the gap filled with a clear, gelatinous substance that caught the light like quartz. And his eyes, they were open, staring, and they were wrong. Wet glass eyes, reflective eyes. "Dad," the word came out as a whisper, a child's word. All her professional distance dissolved in an instant. "He hears you," the old creature said. "He hears everything now. We all hear everything. We're never alone, Dr. Valentine, never empty. Isn't that beautiful?" Lillian stepped forward. The crowd of melon heads didn't move, didn't react, but she could feel their attention like pressure against her skull, a physical weight that made her sinuses ache. She knelt beside her father's body, his preserved, animated, violated body, and touched his hand. It was cold, but it moved, fingers curling around hers with the strength of something that had forgotten it was supposed to be dead. "Lillian," her father's voice, but not her father's voice. It harmonized with the whispers of the crowd, creating that terrible stereo effect. "You came. I knew you would. You're so lonely, sweetheart, so empty. Let us fill you." She jerked her hand back. "This isn't you. This isn't my father. It's better than your father. It's more than your father. It's all of us together forever." The eyes turned toward her and she saw movement in the gelatinous substance filling his cranium, shapes, shadows, something swimming. Crow called it the hive. "We call it family. We want you to be part of it, Lillian. We want you to stop hurting." "I don't want to stop being myself." "Yourself is the problem." The voice was gentler now, almost loving. "Yourself is what makes you suffer. Let go, sweetheart. Let us carry you. Let us be you. Let us make you whole." Lillian stood. The melon heads had moved closer while she knelt, forming a circle around her and her father's preserved corpse. Their wet glass eyes caught her flashlight and threw it back in 1,000 doubled images, and she realized with sick certainty that they were seeing through each other's eyes, that there was no individual perspective anymore, that she was surrounded by a single distributed consciousness wearing many bodies. "The park ranger," she said, "the one who disappeared last week, where is he?" The old creature gestured toward a side passage, receiving his gift, learning to share. "I want to see him." "Why?" "Because I'm a doctor. Because I need to understand what you're doing before I decide whether to join you." The lie came easily. She'd spent years convincing patients to trust her, to open themselves to treatment, to believe that she could help them. Now she used those same skills to buy time, to move deeper into the nightmare, to find something she could use. The melon heads exchanged glances, meaningless since they shared thoughts, but a habit of their former humanity. Then the old one nodded. "This way, but be careful, Dr. Valentine. The path is narrow and the hungry ones are near." "The hungry ones." "The new ones, the ones who haven't learned control. They still take when they should only share." The old creature led her through a passage so narrow she had to turn sideways, her flashlight beam illuminating walls covered in more drawings, more families, more fathers, more stick figures with distended heads. But these were different. These showed the taking, the eating, the incorporation. She tried not to look, she failed. The passage opened into a smaller chamber, and there she found the park ranger. He was young, mid-20s, athletic build, the kind of man who had chosen outdoor work because he loved the wilderness. He was strapped to a makeshift table, his head immobilized in a vise that had been bolted to the stone. His eyes were wide, aware, and he was screaming, or trying to. His jaw had been wired shut. A melon head stood beside him, smaller than the others, its movements jerky with excitement. It held a syringe filled with liquid that caught the light like liquid silver. "Wait," Lillian said. "Let me talk to him first." The small melon head turned. Its eyes were different from the others, less serene, more desperate. It was hungry, she realized. The old one had warned her. This one hadn't learned control. "He needs medicine," it whispered. "He needs to share." "I know, but let me explain it to him. Let me prepare him. It works better if they're prepared, doesn't it?" The creature hesitated. She could see it struggling with the logic, with the shared knowledge of the hive that said incorporation was beautiful, was necessary, was the only cure for the loneliness that afflicted all thinking things. "Prepare him," it agreed and stepped back. Lillian approached the table. The ranger's eyes fixed on her, pleading, and she saw that he recognized her, probably from news coverage of her disgrace, the psychiatrist who'd lost a patient to suicide and been blamed for negligence. She was famous, in a way, notorious. "Listen to me," she whispered, leaning close enough that her breath stirred his hair. "I'm going to get you out of here, but you need to do exactly what I say, not if you understand." He nodded, a tiny movement against the vice. "When I move, you struggle, make noise, draw attention. I'm going to try to distract them." She didn't have a plan beyond that. She didn't have weapons, didn't have backup, didn't have anything but her wits and her knowledge of how desperate, hungry minds worked, whether they were in human skulls or distorted parodies of them. She straightened and turned to the small melon head. "He's ready, but first I want to show you something your family needs to see." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's tape recorder. She'd transferred the contents to her phone, but she'd kept the original as a talisman, a connection to the man who had tried to save her from this. "This is Dr. Vance," she said, pressing play. "He studied you, he wanted to help you. Listen to what he learned." Her father's voice filled the chamber, clinical, precise, describing the bite marks and the jaw structure and the hunger that wasn't natural, that was created, that was Crow's true legacy. The melon heads listened. The small one stepped closer, fascinated by the sound of its creator being analyzed, categorized, understood. Lillian moved. She shoved the small melon head as hard as she could, sending it sprawling into the others who had crowded the chamber entrance. Then she grabbed the syringe from its hand and smashed it against the stone floor, watching the silver liquid spread and soak into the dust. Chapter 6, 6 months later. The nightmare started with the rain. Not ordinary rain. Lillian had grown up in Michigan. She knew rain, but something thicker, more deliberate, as if the sky itself was trying to wash away evidence. She would wake at 3 a.m. to the sound of droplets against her window and find herself standing in the kitchen, her hand on the door handle, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. Her new apartment was on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood. The windows were new, double-paned, supposed to block sound, but she could still hear the whispering. She could still feel the weight of attention pressing against her skull like a physical force. She'd been seeing Dr. Chen for 5 months now, a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma, who never questioned her stories about cult activity in Michigan, who prescribed increasingly powerful antipsychotics that did nothing to stop the dreams. The dreams where she walked through tunnels that breathed, where walls were covered in crayon drawings of families with too large heads, where her father sat in a circle of candlelight and beckoned her to join. "You're experiencing survivor's guilt," Chen had said at their last session. "It's common in kidnapping victims, in those who have escaped cult indoctrination. Your mind is trying to process the trauma by revisiting it, seeking control through repetition." Lillian hadn't told Chen about the photograph. She hadn't told anyone. It was tucked in the bottom of her sock drawer, wrapped in plastic, handled only with gloves. She'd considered taking it to the FBI, to the police, to anyone who might believe that her father was still somehow alive, still somehow conscious, trapped in that underground hell. But what would she say? That monsters had incorporated him into their hive mind. That his empty body was walking around with reflective eyes and a smile that wasn't his. She'd be institutionalized. Or worse, she'd be believed and they'd send more people into those tunnels, more victims for the family to consume. So she endured the nightmares. She took her medication. She tried to rebuild a life that had never been particularly sturdy to begin with. And she waited. For what she couldn't say. But the feeling was there, a pressure behind her sternum that grew stronger with each passing week. Something was coming. Something had been set in motion at Crybaby Bridge, in the tunnels beneath Felt Mansion, and it wasn't finished with her yet. The call came on a Tuesday. She was reviewing patient files. She'd found work at a community mental health center, doing intake assessments for patients the established practices didn't want. It was beneath her training, but it was work, and it kept her occupied during the hours when the whispering was strongest. The number was unfamiliar, Michigan area code. Dr. Valentine, a woman's voice, young, professional. This is Detective Sarah Whitmore with the Allegan County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about the Felt Mansion case. Lillian's hand tightened on the phone. I thought that case was closed. It is, but we've had developments. What kind of developments? A pause, the sound of papers being shuffled. 3 more disappearances in the past month, all in the vicinity of the mansion. And yesterday, we found something in the ruins of the carriage house. I think you need to see it. I can't come to Michigan. I have obligations here. Dr. Valentine, the something we found was a body, and it had your name carved into its chest. Lillian set the phone down very carefully. She counted to 10. She picked it up again. I'll be there tomorrow. Chapter 7, The Body. The Allegan County morgue was in the basement of the county hospital, a brutalist concrete structure that seemed designed to make death as undignified as possible. Detective Whitmore met her at the entrance. 35, compact build, gray eyes that had seen too much and stopped being surprised by any of it. Dr. Valentine, thank you for coming. You said my name was carved into the body. I said a name was carved. Lillian, all caps, deep cuts post-mortem. Show me. The morgue was cold, lit by fluorescents that buzzed like trapped insects. The body was on a steel table, covered by a sheet that Whitmore pulled back with professional detachment. It was a woman, young, mid-20s, blonde hair that had been hacked short recently, judging by the unevenness of the cut. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, but her chest. The letters were precise, carved with surgical skill into the sternum and upper abdomen. Lillian, not deep enough to kill. The cuts were post-mortem, as Whitmore had said, but deep enough to scar if she'd been alive to scar. Do you recognize her? Whitmore asked. Should I? Her name is Jessica Vance. According to our records, she's your niece. Lillian stared at the dead face. The features were familiar now that she looked for it. Her brother Michael's jawline, her mother's cheekbones. She hadn't seen Michael in 12 years, not since their father's disappearance had driven a wedge between them that had become permanent. She hadn't known he had a daughter. I didn't know she existed, Lillian said, and her voice sounded hollow even to her. Michael and I are estranged. I know. I've spoken to him. He says Jessica was researching the Melon head legend for a podcast. She interviewed him about your father's disappearance. The room seemed to tilt. Lillian reached for the edge of the table, found cold steel, held on. She was looking into my father's case. Into the whole history. Crow, the experiments, the disappearances. She found something, Dr. Valentine, something that made her drive to Michigan 2 weeks ago, and something that got her killed. You think the Melon heads killed her? Whitmore's expression didn't change. I think a cult killed her, a group of sick individuals who have been living underground and worshipping Crow's research. I think they carved your name into her chest to send a message, and I think you know more about that message than you're telling me. Lillian looked at her niece's face, at the peace in her features that suggested she'd been prepared for death, welcomed it, maybe even sought it, at the hair that had been cut to match Lillian's own style from 6 months ago. She was trying to look like me, Lillian said. The hair, she was trying to pass as me. Why would she do that? To get close to them, to get inside. Lillian met Whitmore's eyes. Detective, you need to seal those tunnels. You need to fill them with concrete, burn them, do whatever it takes to make sure nothing gets in or out. We've tried 3 times. Each time the workers report equipment malfunctions, disappearances. One man swore he saw children in the construction site watching from the tree line. They're not children. I know what they are, Dr. Valentine. I've read your father's files. I've seen the photographs from the raid 6 months ago. Whitmore's voice dropped. And I think you need to see what's happening down there now, because whatever you encountered, it's changed. It's organized, and it's planning something. Chapter 8: The Nest. They drove to the mansion in silence. Lillian watched the landscape transform from suburban development to rural emptiness, the spaces between houses growing wider until there was nothing but fields and forest and the occasional collapsing barn. The mansion looked different in daylight. Less threatening, more sad, a monument to failed dreams and forgotten wealth. But as they approached, Lillian noticed the details she'd missed before. Curtains in upper windows that hadn't been there 6 months ago, smoke from a chimney that should have been sealed, footprints in the mud that were too small and too numerous to belong to adult humans. We've had the property under surveillance, Whitmore said, but the cameras malfunction within hours of installation. We've found them crushed, buried, sometimes arranged in patterns. What kind of patterns? Circles, spirals, the same arrangements they use in their rituals. They parked at the edge of the formal garden, where topiary animals had grown wild and unrecognizable. Whitmore led her around the mansion's west wing, to the carriage house where Lillian had found the tunnel entrance 6 months ago. The entrance was different now. Someone, the Melon heads or their human collaborators, had expanded it, reinforced it with timber and corrugated metal, created something that looked almost like a shrine. Candles burned at the threshold, their flames impossibly steady in the wind. We've sent deputies down there, Whitmore said. They report tunnels that weren't on the original blueprints, chambers that seemed to move, and sounds whispering, crying, sometimes laughter. Children's laughter. Yes, how did you know? Lillian didn't answer. She was looking at the candles, at the way they burned with a blue tint that suggested chemical enhancement, at the smoke that rose in streams that shouldn't have been possible in the open air. The smoke was being inhaled, collected. They're venting something, she said. The candles are producing a gas. They're directing it into the tunnels. For what purpose? Crow's research. Lillian knelt, careful not to touch the candles, examining the construction of the shrine. He experimented with chemical means of facilitating neural integration, inhalants that would lower inhibitions, increase suggestibility. He called it opening the doors of perception. You think they're drugging their victims? I think they're preparing them, making them receptive to incorporation. Whitmore's radio crackled. She stepped away to answer, and Lillian took the opportunity to move closer to the tunnel entrance. The smell hit her immediately, that sweet rot from 6 months ago, but stronger now, concentrated, almost intoxicating. She felt her head swim, her thoughts begin to fragment. And she heard the whisper. Lil's lion, you've come home. She stepped back, stumbled, found Whitmore's hand on her arm. Dr. Valentine, are you all right? We need to leave now. But now, detective, they're waiting, they've been waiting, and they're hungry. She dragged Whitmore toward the car, ignoring the detective's protests, her eyes fixed on the tree line where movement had caught her attention. Small figures, pale faces, massive heads silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Watching, waiting, patient as evolution. They reached the car. Lillian got in, locked the doors, and only then allowed herself to look back. The mansion stood silent and empty. The tunnel entrance was dark. There was no movement in the trees. But on the windshield of Whitmore's cruiser, someone had traced letters in the condensation. A single word, soon. Chapter 9: The Hive. They drove back to town in silence. Whitmore's hands were steady on the wheel, but Lillian could see the pulse jumping in her throat, the adrenaline aftermath that meant she was processing, trying to fit what she'd seen into a framework that made sense. "Tell me about my niece," Lillian said finally. "What was she working on?" Whitmore didn't answer immediately. They passed a gas station, a church, a cemetery where the headstones leaned like tired soldiers. "She found Crow's original journals," Whitmore said. "The ones that weren't in the Historical Society archives. She was obsessed with understanding the family concept, the hive mind, the shared consciousness. She thought if she could prove it was real, prove it was neurological rather than supernatural, she could develop a treatment. A treatment. To reverse it, to separate the individuals from the collective, to give them back their isolation." Lillian laughed, a harsh sound that surprised them both. She wanted to cure them of being family. "She thought it was a disease, like you do." "I don't think it's a disease, I think it's a predatory adaptation. The Melon heads aren't sick, detective. They're evolved. They've found a way to eliminate competition, to share resources, to function as a superorganism. The only thing they lack is variety, new genetic material, new perspectives. New victims. New family members." Lillian stared out the window at the passing farmland. "Crow designed them to be hungry. He starved them to increase their sensory acuity, their drive to connect. But he never gave them a way to satisfy that hunger permanently. They're always recruiting because they're always empty." They reached the sheriff's station, a low brick building that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and never updated. Whitmore parked and turned to face her. "Dr. Valentine, I'm going to be honest with you. I've got 3 more disappearances, a body with your name carved into it, and a cult living in tunnels beneath a historic landmark. The FBI is 2 days out, and when they arrive, they're going to take over. Before that happens, I want to end this." "How?" "By doing what your niece couldn't. By going down there and understanding what we're dealing with." "That's suicide." "Maybe, but so is waiting. They're getting stronger, Dr. Valentine. The disappearances are accelerating. Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon." Lillian thought of the word on the windshield. Soon. She thought of her father, somewhere in those tunnels, part of something that wore his face and voice but wasn't him. She thought of Jessica, her niece, who had died trying to understand what Lillian had survived. "I need equipment," she said. "Recording devices, cameras, and I need you to promise that if I don't come back, you'll seal those tunnels permanently. No rescue attempts, no investigations, just concrete and fire." Whitmore nodded. "I can promise that." "Then I'll go tonight." Chapter 10: The Descent. They gave her a tactical vest, a helmet with a mounted camera, a radio that probably wouldn't work underground, and a flashlight that could double as a club. Whitmore wanted to send deputies with her, but Lillian refused. "They only take the lonely," she reminded the detective. "A group is safe. An individual is vulnerable. I need to go alone." "That's exactly what they want." "I know, that's why it might work." She entered the tunnels at 11 p.m. when the moon was high and the night was at its darkest. The candles at the entrance had burned down to stubs, but the smell remained, that chemical sweetness that made her thoughts slippery, her boundaries porous. She activated her camera, spoke her location and time into the recording device, and stepped into the dark. The tunnels had changed. That was her first observation, transmitted to Whitmore through the radio before the signal cut out. The walls were no longer bare brick. They were covered in organic growth, something that looked like fungus but moved like muscle, pulsing slightly within rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. She moved deeper, following the main passage. The drawings were still there, crayon figures, anatomical diagrams, the word father repeated until it lost meaning, but they had been supplemented with new images. Photographs printed on paper that shouldn't have survived the damp, showing faces she recognized. Jessica, herself, Detective Whitmore, dozens of others arranged in a grid that covered an entire wall. The family was watching. The family had always been watching. The passage branched and she took the right fork toward the chamber where she'd found her father. The organic growth grew thicker here, luminescent in a way that made her flashlight redundant. She could see the chamber ahead, could see the shapes that filled it. Not 13 this time, many more. She counted 40, 50 melon heads arranged in concentric circles, their massive heads gleaming in the bioluminescent glow. They weren't moving. They were arranged in a pattern, meditative, prayerful, and their breathing was synchronized, creating a harmonic hum that vibrated in Lillian's chest. In the center of the circle, where her father had sat 6 months ago, stood a structure that hadn't been there before. A chair made of bone and wood and something that looked like dried sinew. And in the chair, held upright by straps that had once been leather but were now something else entirely, was Jessica. Her niece's eyes were open, her chest was still, but her head was moving. Not voluntarily, the movement was wrong, jerky, like a puppet on strings. And from the gap in her skull, where the bone had been carefully removed, something protruded. Something that looked like a mushroom or a jellyfish or a brain that had learned to grow outside its container. "Welcome, Lion." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, from the melon heads and from the walls and from Jessica's unmoving lips. It was harmonic, beautiful, terrifying. "We've been expecting you." Lillian stepped into the chamber. The melon heads didn't react, didn't turn, but she could feel their attention shift toward her, a physical pressure that made her steps unsteady. "What have you done to her?" "We've given her what she wanted, what you want, what everyone wants." The voice was gentle, reasonable. "She was lonely, Lion, so lonely. She wanted to understand us, to be part of something larger than herself. We helped her." "You killed her." "We transformed her. Her body serves as a node now, a relay for our thoughts, our feelings, our family. She is happy. She is never alone." Lillian moved closer, her medical training overriding her fear. She could see the surgical precision of the procedure, the skull removed in sections, the dura mater carefully preserved, the implant that pulsed with its own bioluminescence. It was Crow's work, refined over decades, turned into something that could be performed without anesthesia, without consent, without humanity. "She was my family," Lillian said. "And now she is ours, but there's room for you, Lion. There's always room for family." The melon heads moved. Not quickly, not threateningly, but deliberately, creating a path between Lillian and the chair where Jessica waited. The invitation was clear. "Your father is here too," the voice continued. "He misses you. He wants to show you what he's learned, what he's become." "My father is dead." "Death is a boundary, Lion, like the walls of a skull. We don't believe in boundaries. We believe in connection, in sharing, in family." Lillian looked at Jessica, at the thing that had been her niece, now repurposed as a radio tower for collective consciousness. She thought about her father's body, somewhere in this warren of tunnels, wearing his face but not his soul. And she thought about loneliness. "Show me," she said. The melon heads parted fully. The chair was 10 feet away, then 5, then close enough to touch. Jessica's eyes, still human, still aware, tracked her movement, and Lillian saw something in them that broke her heart. Not fear, not pain. Longing. "You want this," Lillian said, not a question. "I want to not be alone," Jessica whispered, and her voice harmonized with the collective, creating the stereo effect that Lillian remembered from 6 months ago. "I want to belong." "You belong to yourself." "Myself is empty." Lillian reached out. Her hand hovered over the pulsing implant. the thing that had transformed Jessica from individual to node. She could feel the heat coming off it, the vibration of thoughts being shared across dozens of minds. What would happen, she asked, if I removed this? Silence, then from the collective. You would kill her, the connection is integrated, separation is death. And what would happen if I joined, if I let you incorporate me? You would be family, you would be never alone, you would be us. Lillian's hand touched the implant. It was warm like skin. It pulsed under her fingers, and for a moment, a single terrible moment, she felt it. The connection, the absence of loneliness, the warmth of being known completely and instantly by dozens of minds. She saw her father's memories, his fear when he'd first discovered the Melon heads, his fascination as he'd studied them, his gradual acceptance of their offer. She saw Jessica's last moments, the fear giving way to curiosity, the curiosity to desire, the desire to surrender. And she saw what the family wanted, not just to recruit, not just to consume. They wanted to expand, to grow, to create a network that would cover the earth, eliminating loneliness forever by eliminating individuality. They were hungry for connection, desperate for it, driven by the programming Crow had installed and the starvation he'd imposed. And they were almost ready. The implant pulsed faster. Lillian felt the invitation deepen, felt the boundaries of her selfhood begin to thin. It would be so easy, so simple. Just let go, let the connection take her, become part of something larger and warmer and safer than the cold isolation of individual existence. She was so lonely. She had always been so lonely. But she was also her father's daughter, and Harold Vance had taught her, in the years before his disappearance, that science was a way of understanding without surrendering. That observation required distance, that to truly see something, you had to remain separate from it. She jerked her hand back. No, she said. The Melon head stirred. The harmonic hum faltered, became discordant. You don't want to be alone, the voice said, and now there was an edge to it, something harder beneath the warmth. I am alone, Lillian said. That's what being human means. We're alone in our skulls, and that loneliness is. It's terrible, it's the worst thing, but it's also who we are. My father understood that. He tried to help you, but he wouldn't join you, because he knew that losing yourself isn't the same as being loved. Your father is us now. His body is, but his self, the thing that made him Harold Vance, that's gone. You ate it, just like you're eating Jessica, just like you want to eat me. The Melon heads moved. Not the slow, deliberate movements of before, but quick, hungry, closing the distance between them. Lillian backed toward the entrance, but the passage was blocked, more of them, emerging from side tunnels, from the shadows, from the very walls themselves. You misunderstand, the voice said, and now it was cold, clinical, the voice of Crow speaking through his creations. We don't eat, we incorporate, we share. We are the next evolution of consciousness, and you are obsolete. Then incorporate this, Lillian said, and she pulled the device Whitmore had given her, a signal jammer designed to disrupt radio communications, and pressed the button. The effect was immediate and devastating. The Melon head screamed, a harmonic shriek that was physical in its intensity, that made the stone walls vibrate and dust rain from the ceiling. The implant in Jessica's skull spasmed, pulsed, went dark. The collective voice fractured into individual screams, dozens of voices that had forgotten how to sound alone. Lillian ran. She didn't look back, didn't check to see if Jessica was still alive, didn't think about her father somewhere in this labyrinth of suffering. She just ran, through the passage, past the photographs, past the organic growth that was already withering without the collective consciousness to sustain it. Behind her the screams continued, but they were changing, becoming more human, more desperate, more alone. She burst into the night air and collapsed onto the grass of the mansion's lawn. The sky was graying with dawn, the stars fading, the world returning to normal. But behind her, the tunnel entrance was dark and silent, and she knew that whatever was happening down there, it wasn't over. The family was hurt, but it wasn't dead. And it would remember this betrayal. Chapter 11: The Aftermath. They found Jessica's body 3 days later. She was in the hydrotherapy chamber, a room that hadn't appeared on any of the mansion's blueprints, that was accessible only through a passage that seemed to shift depending on who was looking for it. Detective Whitmore led the recovery team personally, emerging after 6 hours underground with a report that made the FBI agents shake their heads and the local reporters salivate. The body was intact, the implant was gone, but the skull. Lillian read the autopsy report in her motel room, the same room where she'd listened to her father's tape all those months ago. The skull had been hollowed out. Not removed, not destroyed, but transformed. The bone thinned to translucency, the interior filled with a clear, gelatinous substance that evaporated upon exposure to air. Jessica's brain was gone. In its place, a network of fungal filaments that had woven themselves through the remaining tissue, creating something that resembled a circuit board more than anatomy. She was a node, Lillian told Whitmore when the detective came to check on her. A relay station for their consciousness. When I disrupted the signal, she died. The connection was all that kept her alive. Could it be reversed? Could we have saved her? No, she was already gone. What was left was just infrastructure. They never found Lillian's father, or Arthur Pemberton, or any of the other victims the family had incorporated over the decades. The tunnels were searched, mapped, sealed. But there were always more passages, more chambers, more darkness that seemed to generate itself faster than it could be illuminated. The FBI called it a cult, a group of mentally ill individuals who had developed a sophisticated method of neurological control through a combination of drugs, surgery, and psychological manipulation. They filed charges against a dozen collaborators, local residents who had provided supplies, information, victims, and declared the case closed. But Lillian knew the truth. She'd felt the connection, however briefly. She'd seen the architecture of the family's consciousness, the hunger that drove it, the loneliness that was its origin and its fuel. And she knew it wasn't over. Chapter 12: The Call. 6 weeks after the raid, Lillian was packing to return to Detroit when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, no caller ID. She almost didn't answer. She'd learned to be cautious with unknown numbers, with unexpected contacts, with anything that might be a tendril of the family reaching out to reclaim her. But she answered anyway, because part of her, the lonely part, the empty part, wanted to be reached. Dr. Valentine. The voice was male, elderly, with the careful diction of a professional speaker. This is Arthur Pemberton. Lillian's hand tightened on the phone. Arthur Pemberton is dead. Arthur Pemberton's body is incorporated. His consciousness is shared, but there's enough of him left to make this call, to deliver a message. What message? They're coming for you, Lil. Lion, you hurt them. You disrupted their network. You killed their newest node. They want you to replace her. I'm not going back to those tunnels. You don't have to. They're coming to you. The line went dead. Lillian stood in the motel room, the phone still pressed to her ear, and felt the reality of her situation settle over her like a shroud. She'd thought she could leave, could return to her life, could pretend that what she'd seen was just trauma-induced hallucination. But the family didn't work that way. They were patient, they were everywhere, and they were angry. She packed faster, throwing clothes into her suitcase without folding, grabbing her father's tape recorder, her phone, her wallet. She needed to get out, get on the highway, put miles between herself and Allegan County. The lights went out. Not just the motel lights, the street lights outside, the headlights of passing cars, everything. The darkness was absolute, the darkness of a power grid failure or something worse. She fumbled for her phone, for the flashlight app, and the beam illuminated what should have been impossible. Her motel room door was open. She hadn't opened it, she was sure of that. She'd locked it, chained it, checked it twice. But there it was, swinging slightly on hinges that groaned with each movement. And through the gap, she could see something in the hallway. A head, massive, pale, glistening in the light of her phone, watching. Lillian moved without thinking, diving through the bathroom door, slamming it shut, locking it. There was a window, small but potentially large enough to squeeze through. She could escape. She could run. The window was already open, and something was climbing through. She backed into the corner, her phone clutched like a weapon, her mind racing through options that all ended in capture, incorporation, the loss of everything that made her herself. The figure in the window paused, silhouetted against the parking lot lights that had somehow returned. It was small, child-sized, but its head was grotesquely enlarged, and she could see the reflection of her phone's light in its eyes. Lion, it whispered, and the bathroom tiles vibrated with the sound. Don't run, we don't want to hurt you, we want to welcome you. Get out. We've been waiting, we've been patient, but we're hungry, Lion, so hungry. It moved toward her, and she saw that it was holding something. A syringe, filled with liquid that caught the light like mercury. This won't hurt, it said. You'll feel warm, you'll feel loved, you'll never be alone again. Lillian threw her phone. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't even a conscious decision. But the phone struck the creature's hand, knocking the syringe loose, and in the moment of confusion she charged. She was bigger, stronger, desperate. She shoved past the Melon head, through the bathroom door, into the hallway where more of them waited. A dozen, maybe more, their massive heads blocking the light, their wet glass eyes fixed on her with something that might have been affection. Lion, the chorus was deafening, the harmony beautiful and terrible. Stop running, stop fighting, let us love you. She ran, through the emergency exit into the parking lot to her car. The keys were in her pocket, thank God, her hands shaking so badly she could barely insert them into the lock. They followed, not running, they never ran, but moving with that loping gait, that wrong geometry, closing the distance with terrible efficiency. The engine turned over. She slammed it into reverse, hit the gas, felt the impact as the car struck something soft but solid. She didn't look back. She shifted into drive and accelerated onto the county road, not caring about speed limits, about traffic, about anything except distance. In the rearview mirror she saw them, standing in the parking lot watching her go, their heads gleaming in the moonlight, patient as eternity. She drove for 3 hours before pulling over at a rest stop. Her hands were still shaking. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. And on the passenger seat, where she was sure she hadn't left anything, was a photograph. Her father smiling, his head normal-sized, his eyes human. And behind him, arranged in a careful row, dozens of Melon heads, all smiling, all welcoming. The message, written on the back in her father's handwriting, "Come home, sweetheart, we're waiting." Chapter 13, The Plan. She spent 3 days in a hotel outside Grand Rapids, barely leaving her room, living on vending machine food and fear. She called Detective Whitmore and told her what had happened. The detective promised to check the motel, to increase patrols, to do everything she could. But Lillian knew it wouldn't be enough. The family was patient. They were everywhere. They had waited decades to expand, to grow, to fulfill Crow's vision of a world without loneliness. And they wanted her, not just as a victim, as a convert. They wanted her medical knowledge, her understanding of neurology, her ability to help them refine their methods of incorporation. They wanted her to be one of them. She couldn't run forever, and she couldn't fight them alone. So she made a decision, the only decision she could make. She would go back. Not to join them, to end them. She spent a week researching, planning, preparing. She contacted specialists in fungal biology, in neurochemistry, in controlled demolition. She learned everything she could about the mansion's structure, the tunnel network, the materials that would burn and those that wouldn't. And she made one more call, to her brother. Michael Vance hadn't spoken to her in 12 years. He blamed her for their father's disappearance, for the obsession that had consumed him, for the family dissolution that followed. He'd built a life without her, a wife, a daughter who was now dead, killed by the same forces that had taken their father. "I know who killed Jessica," Lillian said when he answered. "And I know how to stop them, but I need your help." "I don't want to hear it." "Michael, listen to me. The things that killed Jessica, they're not human. They're not even really alive, not in any way we understand. They're a collective consciousness, a hive mind, and they're hungry. They want to incorporate everyone. Everyone who is lonely, who is isolated, who is vulnerable." "You're insane. You've always been insane." "Maybe, but I'm also right. And if I don't stop them, more people will die. More families will be destroyed." "Silence, then. What do you want?" "Access to Dad's research. Everything he collected on Crow, on the hydrocephalus experiments, on the neurological modifications. He knew something about how to stop them. I need to find it." "There's a storage unit," Michael said slowly. "In Lansing. I kept everything after the disappearance in case someone came asking. No one ever did." "Give me the address." "Why should I?" "Because Jessica died trying to understand this. Because Dad died trying to stop it. And because I'm your sister, Michael, I know I've failed you. I know I've failed everyone, but let me try to fix one thing, just one." He gave her the address. Chapter 14, The Research. The storage unit was filled with boxes. Her father's boxes, the ones she'd never been allowed to touch, the ones that held his secret work, his obsession, his eventual destruction. She spent 3 days sorting through them. Medical journals, patient files, photographs that made her stomach turn, and at the bottom of the last box, a leather journal that she'd never seen before. Dr. Silas Crow's personal diary. She read it by flashlight in the storage unit, surrounded by the ghosts of her father's quest. The handwriting was precise, the entries clinical even when describing atrocities. Crow had been a true believer, not a sadist, not a monster by his own estimation, but a scientist pursuing the next stage of human evolution. "The human brain is a prison," he wrote. "Each consciousness locked in its solitary cell, peering out through the bars of the senses, unable to truly touch another soul. Hydrocephalus showed me the way. The expanded cranium creates space, opportunity, possibility. If we could only increase the capacity, the connectivity." He had experimented on 53 children. Not all had survived the initial surgeries. Of those who did, most had died within months, their bodies unable to sustain the neurological load. But 13 had thrived. "The 13, Crow called them. "My first family. They share thoughts, sensations, emotions. They are never alone. They are never empty. They are what humanity should be." But there was a problem. The 13 were hungry, not for food, for connection. They wanted more family. They wanted to expand, to grow, to incorporate others into their collective. Crow had tried to control them. He'd instituted protocols, limitations, ethical guidelines, but the hunger was stronger than his will, and eventually they'd turned on him. The fire hadn't been set by parents. It had been set by the family, to destroy the evidence of Crow's failures and to free themselves from his control. They'd been underground since 1956, growing, learning, waiting. And Lillian found, in the final entries, Crow's theory of how to stop them. "Separation is the key," he wrote. "Their strength lies in connection, in the sharing of consciousness. If that connection is severed, truly severed, not merely disrupted, they will dissolve. Individuality will reassert itself. The isolation they fear will become their reality." But how? How do you sever a connection that is biological, that is integrated into every cell of their being? Crow had never found the answer, but Lillian thought she might have. She'd seen it in the hydrotherapy chamber. The implant, the fungal network, the biological infrastructure that maintained the collective. If she could destroy that infrastructure, not just disrupt it but annihilate it, the family would collapse. She needed fire, chemical fire, hot enough to destroy organic matter without leaving survivors. She needed to collapse the tunnels, seal the entrances, ensure that nothing escaped. And she needed bait. The family wanted her. They'd proven that with Jessica, with the motel, with the photograph in her car. If she returned, if she offered herself, they would gather. They would prepare. They would be vulnerable. It was suicide, she knew that, but it was also the only way. She called Whitmore and told her the plan. Chapter 15, The Ritual. They went in at dawn, Whitmore, 3 deputies, and Lillian. The plan was simple. Lillian would enter the tunnels alone, draw the family into the hydrotherapy chamber, and signal for the team to deploy incendiary devices. The heat would be intense enough to destroy the organic infrastructure. The collapsed tunnels would seal the rest. It was a death sentence for Lillian. She knew that. The family wouldn't let her go, not this time. They'd learned from her previous escapes. They'd be prepared. But she'd accepted it. She'd written a letter to Michael, explaining everything, apologizing for everything. She'd arranged her affairs, paid her debts, made her peace. She was ready. The entrance was different again. The shrine had been expanded, decorated, made welcoming. Candles burned in patterns that suggested ritual, ceremony, celebration. They were expecting her. She descended the stairs into the dark. The organic growth on the walls was thicker now, luminescent, pulsing with the rhythm of the family's collective heartbeat. She could feel them ahead, waiting, patient and hungry. "Lil's lion," the whisper came from everywhere, warm and welcoming. "You came home." "I'm here," she said, and her voice didn't shake. "I want to understand. I want to join." "We know, we've always known. Come to us, Lil. Lion, come to family." She walked through passages that seemed to shift, to breathe, to welcome her. The drawings on the walls were different now, not just families but specific faces. Her face, Jessica's face, her father's face, all smiling, all welcoming, all part of the network. The hydrotherapy chamber was transformed. The chair where Jessica had died was gone, replaced by something larger, more elaborate, a throne of bone and wood and fungal growth, surrounded by the Melon heads in their full numbers, more than 50 now, growing every day. And on the throne, wearing a crown of fungal filaments, sat her father. "Dad," she said, and the word caught in her throat. "Lillian," his voice was harmonic, beautiful, wrong. "You've finally come. We've been waiting so long." "I know, I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, be ready. The ceremony is prepared. The gift is waiting." He gestured and the crowd parted. In the center of the chamber where the chair had been stood a table, and on the table, held by straps that were already in place, was Detective Whitmore. Lillian stared. "What? How?" "She followed you," her father said. "She didn't trust you. She thought you might betray us. And she was right, wasn't she, Lil? Lion, you planned to destroy us, to burn us, to separate us." The Melon heads moved closer, surrounding her. She was trapped, surrounded, with no escape route. "But we knew," her father continued. "We always know. We share everything, remember, including knowledge, including plans." "Then why let me come?" "Because we want you to choose." He rose from the throne, moved toward her with that wrong, loping gait. "We don't want to force you, Lil. Lion, we want you to see, to understand, to choose family freely." He reached her. His hand, cold, damp, wrong, touched her face. She felt the connection instantly, the sharing of thoughts, the absence of loneliness. She saw what he saw. The beauty of the collective, the warmth of constant connection, the end of all isolation and fear. She felt the hunger, yes, but also the love, the desperate, hungry love of beings who had never been alone and couldn't imagine the horror of it. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It is," her father agreed. "It's everything we ever wanted, no more loneliness, no more emptiness, just family." "But it's not real." The connection wavered. "What?" "It's not real love, it's hunger. You're not connected because you love each other. You're connected because you're starving. Crow made you hungry and you've been trying to fill that hunger ever since. But it never fills, does it? It never ends." Silence. "You're not a family, you're a prison. Each of you trapped in the others, unable to escape, unable to be alone. You're not evolved, you're addicted." The harmony broke. The Melon head screamed, a discordant shriek of rage and pain, and Lillian felt the physical pressure of their attention crushing her skull. "Kill her," her father said, and his voice was cold, individual, alone. "Incorporate her, make her part of us." The Melon head surged forward. Lillian had one chance, one desperate, hopeless chance. She pulled the detonator from her pocket, the one she'd hidden, the one they hadn't found in their search, and pressed the button. The explosion wasn't just fire. It was thermite, magnesium, chemicals that burned at temperatures that destroyed organic matter instantly. She'd placed the charges herself in the hours before dawn, in passages she'd memorized from Crow's diagrams. The family had known her plan, but they hadn't known she'd already prepared. Fire engulfed the chamber. The Melon head screamed, truly screamed, individual voices raised in terror, and the organic infrastructure that maintained their connection began to burn. Lillian ran, not toward the entrance that was blocked by flame, but toward the side passage she'd mapped, the one that led to the surface near the lake shore. Behind her, she could feel the family dissolving, the connections severing, individual consciousness reasserting itself after decades of forced sharing. "Lion," her father's voice alone now terrified, "don't leave us, don't make us be alone." She didn't look back. The passage was narrow, twisting, but she knew the way. She could feel the heat at her back, could hear the screams that were becoming more human with every passing second. The family was dying. The hive was collapsing. And then she was outside on the shore of the lake, the mansion burning behind her, the sky reddening with dawn and fire. She kept running until she reached her car, until she was on the highway, until the flames were just a glow on the horizon. Chapter 16: The Aftermath. They never found her father's body, or any of the others. The fire burned for 3 days, consuming the mansion, the tunnels, the evidence of Crow's crimes and his creations. When it finally died, there was nothing left but ash and the lingering smell of burning organic matter. The official story was a gas leak, an accident, a tragedy for the historical society. But Lillian knew the truth. She'd felt it when the fire started, the severing of connections, the return of isolation, the horror of being alone after decades of forced togetherness. The family had died screaming, each individual suddenly separate, suddenly solitary, suddenly face to face with the emptiness they'd tried to escape. She returned to Detroit. She tried to resume her life. She took her medication, the diuretics for her migraines, the anti-anxiety pills, the sleep aids. But the migraines got worse. The pressure in her skull increased, a constant presence that made her vision blur and her thoughts scatter. She went to a neurologist, had an MRI. The results were inconclusive. "There's something," the doctor said, pointing at the scan. "A shadow, probably nothing, an artifact, a glitch, but let's do a follow-up in 6 months." Lillian looked at the shadow. It was small, irregular, located in the region where the Melon head had touched her, where her father had connected with her, where the family had tried to claim her. It looked like a seed. She went home. She took her diuretic, the medication that treated hydrocephalus by reducing fluid pressure in the skull. She counted the pills, 29 left, should last a month. She went to bed. She woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of rain, or something like rain. Scraping against the window, against the wall, a child's sound, or something that had learned to mimic one. Lil's lion. She didn't move, didn't breathe, just lay in the dark waiting. The sound stopped. She got up, went to the window, looked out at the empty street. Nothing. She went to the bathroom, took her medication, counted the pills again. 28. Hadn't there been 29? She counted again, 28. Maybe she'd miscounted. Maybe she'd taken one and forgotten. Or maybe something had taken one. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, at the dark circles under her eyes, at the way her pupils seemed too large, too dilated, even in the bright bathroom light. She thought of the shadow on the MRI, the seed, the possibility that the connection hadn't been severed, only changed, transformed, made patient. She looked at the pill bottle, at the empty floor where it had rolled, where it shouldn't have been. And she heard the whisper, not outside but inside, not in her ears but in her mind. "We're waiting, Lil, lion, we're always waiting." She picked up the pill bottle, opened it, poured the contents into her hand. 27 pills. She swallowed one, then another, then all of them, dry swallowing until her throat burned, until the bottle was empty, until there was nothing left to take. The headache spiked, then faded. The pressure in her skull eased. The whispering stopped. She went back to bed. She slept. She dreamed of families, of connection, of the warmth of never being alone. She didn't wake up. Epilogue. 1 year later. The hiker was named David Chen, a software engineer from Seattle who'd taken a week off to backpack the Manistee River Trail. He was experienced, prepared, careful. He disappeared on the third day. No tracks, no struggle, no sign of what had happened. The search party found his tent first, then his pack, then his camera dropped in the mud but still functional. The last photo showed Chen smiling, his arm around someone who hadn't been in any of his previous shots. A woman, dark hair, dark circles under her eyes, a smile that was too wide, too knowing. The EXIF data said the photo was taken at 3:47 a.m. The search team didn't recognize her, but when they ran the image through facial recognition, the computer flagged a match. Dr. Lillian Valentine declared dead 11 months prior, body never found. In the photo, her shadow stretched behind her, extending across the forest floor in a shape that wasn't human. That was too large. That had too many heads. The file was named Lillian, JPG. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible, something else. A face in the trees, massive, pale, glistening. Smiling. Waiting. Thank you for listening to tonight's stories. If you enjoyed them, please leave a like and subscribe.